Welcome back to Follow the Rabbit, co-hosted by Igor Schwartzman and me, Johannes Kleske. Follow the Rabbit is a podcast where we decode cultural phenomena and explore emerging trends to help you update your mental models of the world. And today we're joined by Cyril Maury from Stride Partners, who spent 15 years studying how people actually behave around health. Not what they say they do, but what they really do. He's helping companies to better understand human behavior. And together we dig into a fascinating pendulum swing from the 20th century's one-size-fits-all pharmaceutical production to today's hyper-personalized health fragmentation. So yes, we have another episode on health, and we look at a lot of different aspects. We look at the big picture, what Cyril has learned from all of his investigations and studies. And we also look into wearables because we recorded this episode in the week that RFK Jr. announced his big campaign to have every American wear a wearable within 4 years. Quick note on that, since we recorded the episode, John Oliver has released a segment on the MAHA movement, and it became quite clear that this whole campaign is more of a grift because, for example, RFK Jr.'s candidate for Surgeon General is the co-founder of Levels, the CGM company that is doing rather well in the US. So take from that what you will. This is a fascinating episode. It was really great talking to Cyril about the bigger picture. And at the end, Cyril gives us his insight into what is actually helping with a long and healthy life. And it has very little to do with technology. So let's dig in.
Hello, and welcome back to Follow the Rabbit. Today we're talking about health and its many phases that it has had now over the last couple of years, because we have this wonderful, magical thing called the internet. And if you're a listener of Follow the Rabbit for regular time, you know that we've been talking about health quite a bit. We actually did a whole season on health as the new luxury. We talked already about a couple of those things that we're going to talk about today as well: CGMs, health trackers, quantified self. But today we actually have Cyril with us, who has quite a lot of research experience in that space. And after introducing himself to the audience, he will tell us what he learned. Hi, Cyril.
Hi, Igor. Hi, Johannes. Thanks for having me here. Really looking forward to the conversations. We obviously had previous conversations, so I know there's a lot of topics that we can exchange upon. And just like as a brief introduction, so people know from where I'm talking. So I'm Cyril, and I'm a partner at Stride Partners, and I've been at Stride Partners for about 5 years now, but worked for about 15 in the same space. What is that space? What do we do at Stride Partners? Well, we really try to use as many methodologies as possible to understand people and behaviors. What are those methodologies? Ethnography is something that we do a lot. So we try to really spend time physically with people in their environment. Data science is also something that we use a lot. Another way to get really rich behavioral data and not attitudinal data. And then we use some more classic methodologies, such as, just large surveys, which are looking at a bit more into the attitudinal side of things. And armed, equipped with this deep, rich understanding of people and their behavior, we then provide recommendations for companies of all types. A lot of them tend to be technology companies, but not only. For example, we work a lot in healthcare as well. And this is one of the reasons why I think we'll be able to have a rich conversation, and then other sectors as well, financial services and so on. So that's in a nutshell what we try to do. And I think that it puts me and us in a good position to actually have a lot of these insights, these nuggets, into people's changing behaviors around health to have that lively conversation.
Yeah. So one thing that we really want to explore in this conversation is the fragmentation of health and medical authority. A long time ago now, we also did a project for a pharmaceutical company back when we were still running third wave. And something that we observed even back then was, what we called the unbundling of health, where a lot of both, authority and also just how it is being, well, I will use the word dispensed, is changing quite significantly. And I think over the last 5 years, that trend only accelerated. And an example that I kind of like to use is this kind of the TikTok effect or the Reddit effect on everything. So we have like a huge usage of Ozempic, but not everybody can afford it. So there are like, there are TikTok hashtags like Oatsempic, where people are giving advice how to use oats to create the same effect. And the problem is that, a lot of that is very hard to differentiate. Who is an actual source, who is not. I'm following a doctor who posts videos for the Washington Post, and she's like an actual doctor and has like actual authority, but her account pretty much looks the same as everyone else's account posting, the only thing is really that they have a code, but everybody can get a white code. So what I'm kind of getting to is I think it's kind of fascinating how much fragmentation we're seeing in the market and in the behavior of customers. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that.
Yeah. I mean, that definitely rings true. And as we've done these healthcare projects over the last 10 years, if I'm counting like my time before Stripe Partners, it is definitely a trend that we have seen, right? Like this increased, and you can see it in the positive and in the negative sense. I think we can actually, look at it from a neutral point of view, which is just, it used to be the case more than people trusted authority in general, and medical authority was perhaps one of the most trusted authority. And then over the last 10 years, and it accelerated, I think, a lot after COVID, obviously, the trust in institutions and particularly in the healthcare system has dropped significantly. And here, like, there's like some fairly good, surveys to look at. There's like this Pew Research Center survey that they do every year, trust institution, and you actually see that it's dropping significantly for quite a lot of these institutions. And then we can look at, okay, so why is that the case? That's the first thing that we can do, right? And it's like, certainly we can talk about like all different reasons why it is, to a degree, definitely understandable. Is it a good thing? Again, we don't know, but it's really understandable why it might be the case that people, decide that it is a good thing for them to try to make these decisions more by themselves. And then, like, the other thing I think which is interesting to look at is, to a degree, if you position this over like a longer time frame, you actually see that some of these trends come from way before digitization, for example. And I'm just like here, like, going to name one, which is interesting because it's not that well known. So one of the expressions of this, the fact that people feel more empowered to make decisions about their health, is that they tend to follow less the prescription guidelines of the pharmaceutical companies, right? So talking about something that you mentioned, Ozempic or any form of GLP-1 agonist. Well, people, to your point, find that it is a fairly expensive medicine, and so not all of them can get access to it. What are some of the different strategies that they can use in order to still get some of the benefits that they perceive they would get from the medicine? One, they can, go to TikTok, and here, like, they will have this doctor that says, well, if you eat oatmeal or this other supplement, that's going to have the natural Ozempic, if you will. That's one way. Another way is they might say, well, maybe I can actually buy one dose of Ozempic, but instead of shooting it like all at once, I'm going to see if I can make it last. I'm going to see if there's not ways to reappropriate that and have a much more personalized dosage to what I'm trying to do. And I'm going to completely bypass any form of medical authority here, right? Doing that. Risky for sure, but lots of people are doing this. And all of this to say that this trend of trying to find what is the right dosage for you and not to follow the guidelines is something that is a reaction to a very long trend that we've seen in the pharmaceutical industry, which started more or less in the 20th century, where we started to have really the beginning of the industrialization of the production of drugs and of the healthcare system, which led to the necessity for the system to really try to move away from personalization, right? And to have processes, logistics, a whole chain that would allow for delivering and producing these drugs at scale. And this is the reason, it's a business reason, if you will, that led us to the point where today, where if you think of drugs and medicine, you really have the feeling that it is not really personalized, right? Like, and so we're trying to, things are changing at the margins, but the system in itself is a system where really what works for the industry is, well, each person is going to have the same dosage. And if you think about it, just like to take a funny example, it's a little bit bizarre that I'm like, I don't know, I'm like 60 kilos or something. I'm pretty thin. Someone who's like 150 kilos, if you look at the dosage recommendations of, say, ibuprofen, it's going to be exactly the same. They're going to be, okay, well, you know what? You take just like 1 gram. The effects are going to be widely different, right? Why is that the case? Is because there is a need for the industry for a high degree of industrialization, and that's what allows like to be efficient in a sense. Is it the best for an individual? Not necessarily, and that I think highlights a tension which is inherent to any healthcare decision that you have, which is what is good for the public is not necessarily what's best for the individual, right? And so that's a key tension which people are pushing against when they are trying to find the best solution for them. And just as, and we can talk about that later because it's like it's an adjacent space. But if you think of another big trend, which is aging medicine and anti-aging treatments, here again you will have recommendations that make a lot of sense at the systemic level, which is, well, you should be screened, at 50 and not before for, let's say, prostate cancer or whatever it is. Is it because it's the best for an individual? Well, actually, not necessarily. It is the best because that is the optimal age if you look into the benefits of the individual and how much the system can support in terms of, delivering like this scans and so on and so forth. So that's like a tension here that, again, I think is quite interesting because it shows that not everyone is equal against health as well. Even if, in I would say continental Europe, that's the narrative, but the reality is that even in continental Europe, that's not.
I find it super fascinating. So if I get you right, there's always this notion there is never a continuous linear development, but there's always trend and counter trend. There is like waves of things happening, and so we're coming off of a wave of mass pharmaceutical production, which has been amazing for population health. Like it's completely different than it has been 200 years ago. And people are so much more healthy in certain parts. Stuff that used to be a problem is not a problem anymore because we have widespread pharmaceutical availability of medicine. But now technology kind of has moved on. Now we have options that are much more personalized, and all of a sudden we are more used to, that actually should be more specific to me. And I mean, for me, it's interesting to observe like the quantified self movement over the last like 15 to 20 years, who started with actually data is really helpful. And if I have my personal data, I can have like understanding of like N of 1 experiments. So just myself. In the beginning, they would always like write this all down in Excel sheets, and then like the first fitness tracker would come about. But they're all, again, are very based on population health. Like the perfect example for me is always BMI. BMI is super helpful if you look at the whole of population. Like, are we getting fatter or like more obese as like a nation or as like a population? But it doesn't really make sense on an individual point of view because we're so different. Like, and somebody who is super jacked has the same BMI as somebody who's really obese, and it's a very different context, but the numbers don't work that way. So what are you observing from users that show this, like, are we really going to a different trajectory of the understanding of health and everything connected to that we know that we're coming off of this like mass production in public health, going to much more personalized health, I guess?
Yeah. I think that's a very good way to summarize it. I think that most trends really tend to be a reaction to a previous phase. And sometimes, since like the wavelengths of those phases can be quite long, we almost forget what was before. And we think that it comes like ex nihilo, but it's very rarely the case. And as you said, I think that the 20th century has been the century where mass medicine was born, and it revolutionized, right? Like at the macro level, not only how long people live, so the lifespan, but also like the health span, like how healthy people live. Now we're at a point where actually in the Western world, the benefits at the macro level are becoming increasingly harder to get, right? Like you have like the marginal gains are really difficult. And as we all know, even in the United States, like, the lifespan has been declining, and now it's back to flat, but it has been declining, which is unprecedented. How do individual choices fit into that particular trend? From what I could observe, I would say that you have a minority of people, they're like very active, but they're minority, who have an actual deep understanding of this, and they will really actively try to find the best solutions for themselves as an equal one. And they're like, very articulate, like they tend to be, just like to generalize, like people who either like work in tech or work like in the health sciences sector, very rigorous and rational. And they're like, okay, so what's best for the system is great, but I have the means to actually go beyond that, and I want gains for myself, right? And they will be a large cohort of the people who are into this quantified self movement. Later we'll talk about the wearables. They go into that. Then like they do all the things that you know about. So they will do like genetic testing. They will try to see, does like a particular molecule, will it work better or worse on me because of my particular genetic specificities? And then like they will also try to get as much information in terms of their blood work and so on and so forth. But that's a minority of people. And then you have, I think, a vastly larger population who are not like completely as cognizant of those changes, and they don't make like these rational individual choices. However, they have like this diffuse feeling that something's not right with the pharmaceutical industry, right? That the incentives are not aligned. And here it's much more like a value-based or even like identity-based choices that they make, which is, I don't trust them, hence I'm going to regain control. And then it is something much more like identity-based, again, like much more like emotional. And it's about control. It's about being in the camp of the people who know of the people who are not fooled by the industry. And here, this is when it really has like a lot of surface contact area with some other belief systems, that largely are against institutions in general. I would say that what's interesting is probably like the healthcare institution is the one that is the most representative of this distrust in other institutions. But there is a high level of correlation. If someone distrusts the healthcare system, the most likely is they're going to distrust like these other institutions.
So maybe I think like the historic part, I think, is a very valuable kind of component in terms of like how we got to where we got. But now I wonder, we have economics on one side and from the industry trying to achieve as much efficiency into the system. And I think that applies also to the question of insurers as well. Like when is the right start to test someone. On average, it's at 45 or 50, because otherwise the system will just collapse under the kind of economic pressure of people going into it. And technology introduced us, and I think, and I guess what I'm trying to understand, what the chicken and egg problem in behavior, and it is that one way to look at it is that the distrust into the scaled system is the thing that drove us to the usage of quantified self. It's driving us to usage of getting information about health approaches, not from our medical practitioners, but from communities of like-minded people. I'm looking at a lot of research during a project that I did, where a lot of, while vastly, very hard to say that Gen Z is one thing, but Gen Z, as on the one hand, on average, despite having less financial kind of resources, is investing much more into the idea of longevity, because they distrust the system, and they know that the system will punish them for actually being not well. So a lot of that behavior seems to me driven by economic kind of factors, and then technology kind of getting, as a mediator in between and allowing us to think that we can adjust everything to our personal needs. Is that something that you see in your work as well?
Yeah, no, for sure. I would say that there's we can probably categorize the drivers in two types. You have what I would call the enablers. And so the enablers is technology, right? Now, if you have the quantified self, for example, if you have genetic testing, that actually unlocks a lot of possibilities in terms of personalized medicines that did not exist beforehand. So what it creates here is that you create a positive incentive for people to lean into that space, because they know that if they do, some good things can happen for them later, right? And then you have the repellers, which is stuff that actually pushes people into that space, because the previous state of affairs where they were, which was, I'm just one out of many in that healthcare system, is not satisfying for them. And when you really have a really powerful trend, is when you have these two things that align. And so you basically have more and more enablers, which we have now, because again, I think now it's an incredible moment in terms of how much you can know about someone, right? And just as a digression here, I think that now we are at the moment of really the explosion of the diagnostic phase of medicine. So we can do so much more in terms of understanding the specificities of someone, their biomarkers and so on. We're not yet at the stage where we can do so much in terms of improving upon that diagnostic, right? So we'll be able to know so much about you, but we haven't unlocked completely revolutionary, medicines or treatments to then say, okay, so then we're going to, based on that information, allow you to have 10, 15 more years of good health. That's, I think, will come soon, but it hasn't come yet. When that comes, what does that do? It does it boosts, it turbocharges that positive attractors of that trend. And I think that if we look 5-10 years into the future, when that's going to happen, we're going to have even more people coming into that personalization trend in medicine.
Let me quickly. I had to smile a bit when you laid it out. So we're very good at diagnostics. We're not so good yet at what to do about it. And I find this, for me, is a fascinating field, because I think right now the biggest problem we have is that there is a conversation of, oh, you just need the better tools, you need the better supplements and pharmaceutical stuff and the pills, and they will solve that. When actually, for most of the population, it is absolutely clear what the therapy is move more, eat better.
It's in that case, that is very true. But you don't even need any form of diagnostics.
No.
There. It's you go, we see the person, and you could know that 50 years ago. and yes, and that is very true. And then like that becomes a behavioral science problem, which is if you know that what you're doing is leading to poor outcomes, and you know what you need to do in order to get out of that pathway, and you don't do it, how can we nudge you to doing it more? And that is a very big problem for the healthcare system as a whole, I would say. But no, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, and also, and I think it is also a challenge for the healthcare system, because it is actually quite clear, and the business models are different. Like if my job is just to get you to move more or buy more plants, then there is not much money to be made in that. And I think that for me is always like the big elephant in the room with everything about the healthcare system, is that it is so hard to have a match between what is helpful and what you can make money on. And I think this is in this context is so interesting. So and just to give you like an example and because wearables are one of the topics that I always come about with this, and I think has been one of the biggest levers in the last like 10 years, especially with like the success of the Apple Watch, as I think the health tracker that has sold millions and millions, and a lot of people are wearing. It has become much more like, oh, I understand like my body a bit better. Also, it's very generalized, so like the numbers could mean different things in different contexts. But I find it interesting. So just the thing that I thought of is, so Whoop this year has introduced a new feature for longevity. So they give you like a what they call Whoop age, which is basically saying it's your biological age. It's not your chronological age, like how old you are, but how old is your body. And they base it on different metrics. The scientific like evidence around like biological clocks or ages is murky, but I think it works quite well just as a metric or an incentive that gets you. And all of the things that you can do about this is sports based. Like, so they say, oh, if you spend like 2 hours a week in like strength training and like this much time in like zone 1 to zone 3 heart rate and an hour a week in zone. So it's all about like, how do you move more? And it gives you just numbers to hit. Sorry, talking about healthcare system out there. And so I find it interesting how that they basically tell you to move more and then give you a number to hit. Like same thing with the 10,000 steps, where like, oh, that is just an invention. Yeah, but it's still a helpful one, like, because it's just like a number you hit. And if you move 10,000 steps, it's quite interesting. What do you think about these? Like, what's helpful? These variables. What's your observation from the research you did? Like, what does it do with people, and what point are we at now? It's been going for some years. What do you see like change in behaviors?
Yeah, I think, and that is a fascinating space. I think there's like a couple of things, which is how do you characterize, how do you qualify what is a good outcome in using this health-based the wearables, right? So these devices. I think that one is, well, you certainly want people to be in better health on some measures of that. I think that for that, these biological ages metrics, I think that lots of the different brands now have it. So I think it's on the Garmin, it's actually called your biological age directly. That's super useful. I do have like one perhaps like thoughts about it, which is I'm pretty sure that the manufacturers of the device, they kind of like use it they would always give people a lower age than, or most often like than the actual age. So then like it creates like a positive feeling, and it wants you to engage more with the services, right? With the actual platform, because you're like, oh wow, yeah. I mean, I'm certainly not 42. I'm actually 35, as the watch is saying, and I think I've seen like quite a few users that find this a little bit like it hooks them in to the service.
Interesting.
There is like some parallel, I think, to remember like the LLMs when I think it was like, I don't know what release of ChatGPT, and they became super psychophantic. Like they tend to be very positive, but they were like, oh my God, that is like such the best idea in the world. Like you're so smart, you're incredible.
Wait, my idea isn't the best?
And they realized that this is actually what gets the most engagement from users. Like people actually want to have like these positive signals getting back at them. And I think that to a degree, this biological edge can be that. But then like, even if it is to a degree, I think that if it gets people to actually move more, to actually do more exercise, to do what it takes to lower that metric, it's good. Then there is one thing that we need to talk about here as well, which is there is good and bad in these aggregate health score, right? And to your point, you were like, okay, so how do they actually compute that biological age? Sometimes it's not very clear. And I think that the design principles that should be embraced by all these manufacturers is transparency, right? So the actual biological age, 10% is your heart rate variability. 20% is your weight or your BMI. 20% is how often you actually go and you do zone 2 or zone whatever exercise in the last week. And you need that transparency because then it allows for one thing, which is different people will use these KPIs or metrics differently. For some people, it's actually enough. And what they want is just the aggregate. They don't want the complexity. They want to use it almost as a North Star. Fine, but some other people, like they need and they want to go deeper and they want to be able to use these watches in a way that allows them to better feel and sense their own bodies and their own sensations, right? And here, what is very powerful to do that is if you deconstruct these aggregate metrics into all of their different components, and then like you help people to actually measure themselves against each one of them. And that is true for the biological age. It's perhaps even more true with another aggregate score, which most of them, like all the manufacturers have, which is like that measure of how rested you are at any given moment, right? So for example, I use the Garmin. For the Garmin, I think it's your fitness score or something like that. But each one of them has a different one. And so it's basically something that goes down if you're stressed. So if you have like
body battery.
The body battery, exactly. And then like you recharge it if you sleep well and if you're rested and so on, right? It's useful, but it has like that downside that it obfuscates a lot as well. And it's almost like too processed. And it then like tends to relieve people of the actual need to feel themselves, which is what we call like interoception. So it's that ability to feel different sensations within your body. So you have like the cognitive abilities, which is the ability to think and think about what you're thinking. So it's really in the brain. And then you have anything that is not in the brain that is more about, do I feel tense? Do I feel like how my heart is beating and so on? That's the interoception. And there is a risk that the wearables, by providing these aggregate scores, kind of like take away the need for people to develop, that skill, which is a very useful skill, which is how do I actually feel and what does it mean for me?
So maybe like I'm the person here in the room who doesn't use any trackers, and I'm even like I used to have an Apple Watch, but I'm not using it anymore, and I'm going on a run without tracking anything, and mostly about me being, I guess, a little bit lazy as well, where I just don't want to kind of think about all the, tools that I need to put on and stuff like that. But I also just didn't really think that they're that valuable, and they do distract me personally. Like this is like, I'm trying to then kind of look at the screen and kind of watch it. Now, I am actually quite a big fan of BJ Fogg's kind of like formula of behavior model, where he defines behavior as being a combination out of motivation, ability, and prompting. And what I do think is that those services and a lot of those devices are really well engineered to provide prompts or triggers, like like depending on how you look at it. So they're kind of like, they're really great at giving you kind of like things that will, they change the language. They introduce, they introduce a longevity thing. They introduce the thing, and they're kind of like giving you a reason to look at the screen, but they're actually quite bad at giving you a long-term motivation to do something. But I think where they even are worse, and I think that comes back to your point about diagnostics versus ability to actually change it, they're really bad at giving people the ability to sustain something, and create like a change in their life. Because it really doesn't matter that my sleep tracker tells me that I sleep badly because of the stress that I have at work if I can't really change anything about my work. And I think most of the people who are buying those tools are expecting help that those tools can't really provide, because their ability to provide change in our life is so limited, and the reasons why I sleep badly are tied to something else. So and that's kind of like so where I land with this, that a lot of people are buying this. And I think like what they're buying and why they're buying it is different. So when people are buying an Apple Watch, they often justify it by their ability to track health reasons. But, like what they're buying is actually really an Apple Watch that helps them pay for things faster. And I think like a lot of that space is triggered by very superficial kind of like things that are not really helping people, and instead introducing new anxieties really into the conversation.
I think it's a very fair point, and that is real. Like there is a lot of literature that shows that for a lot of people, the having more metrics to follow, and there's most of the literature, the core literature is really on sleep tracking. You have like, I can't remember exactly like the numbers, but about like 30% of people who had sleep trackers in one study actually reported that looking at the fact of the habit of looking at the numbers created more anxiety, and so overall, like they were sleeping worse than when they didn't have like
autosomnia. I think is the term,
exactly.
right? If you
yeah, absolutely, autosomnia. Thank you. So that is real. Now, to your point and the ability, what is the benefit that these devices can bring to people? Here, I think there is something that the manufacturers are doing wrong. What they're trying to do is that they're trying to incorporate more analytics and AI into all of these platforms, right? And it's the race. It's almost like it's mimicking the race of all the different LLMs that have the benchmarks and which one is smarter, right? And then like they're doing the same thing. That, okay, well, you know what? We're going to better analyze all these data points and biomarkers, and then we're going to give you like an even more precise score of sleep or of readiness or whatever it is. And then we're going to do another thing, which is we're going to have now like this kind of AI-based interface that will tell you exactly what you need to do. So it will tell you, well, you know what? Today, based on your score, you should not exercise. Don't exercise today. And then like the day after, it's like, okay, now you can run for 20 minutes. And what we've seen when we did like this actual ethnographic research project, talking to people, is that first of all, when you try to be so precise, you're very often wrong, right? So then like you have like, it's basically like a cognitive dissonance. It was like, well, actually I feel fine, and the reason like it's off, it's because I ate too much or I did this. I actually want to go and exercise. And so the more the manufacturers are going into that way, which is we're going to do things instead of people. We're going to replace people, and we're going to replace not only their sensing ability, but their sense-making ability, and the recommendation that we give them on this, based on all of this, the worse it's going to go. And the more you're going to have a backlash of people like finding that these wearables are actually not super useful. However, I think there's another route of travel which the manufacturer companies should go to, which is, okay, there is an increased ability to make sense of data, right? Like that is true. But the right way to use it is to use it in a conversational dialogic way with the users. And it's instead of telling them, well, today you should not exercise, is you actually reverse things. And instead of telling them what you think they should do based on the score that you have, you're like, you start with how you're feeling today, right? Before you even see the actual score. And then like the person is forced to actually exercise that what we call somatic muscle, right? Like the ability to feel, to sense, and to sense makes like their own sensations. And they need to pause, they need to reflect. And the wearable actually helps them to do that. Like it prompts them to actually do that. And then like they come with a perspective on this. And then like the actual wearable, like the interface will enter in a dialogue with them. Oh, well, that is interesting because it looks like actually your sleep score wasn't that great. So why do you think it's the case that, you feel rested when you weren't? Well, in terms of running, well, I mean, if you feel right, you probably should go running, but maybe like at the end of the day, we should try to see, pause and see, are you still feeling right? And then like you build in that conversation, really knowledge that is co-constructed between the AI and the person and really unique to the actual person's context and biomarkers. I think that one of the mistakes that the designers of these devices are trying to do now is that they think that the biomarkers alone are enough. And based on that, they're going to analyze and they're going to provide recommendations. No. What they need to do is that's one part of the equation, but the other part is perhaps 80% is everything else that happened in someone's life, in their work, what they're thinking about, what is their plan for the day? Is it sunny? Is it not sunny? And how they're actually perceiving and making sense of all that information. So I think that there is a big opportunity here for a new type of device, which actually really leverages the conversational ability of AI and the analytics abilities of AI. And that to a degree goes way beyond what the realm and space for wearables is as it is defined now. It needs to go much beyond, and it needs to be something which is helping people make sense of themselves and their health in the actual context of their daily lives.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting, I agree with everything. And I think it's actually quite interesting to, I could imagine instantly an interface in which this kind of conversation happens. But at the same time, I also wonder, and I'm this is like me wondering, there are a lot of things on my phone that are vying for my attention, that require, a significant amount of time at a specific kind of place during the day. And I like that relationship, and because I think it's a relationship that is being built between the person doing it and the system that is trying to help me establish a new behavior, which is really hard. Like establishing new routines, new behaviors is something really hard. And I think, what you described helps me imagine how to do this. Now, on a practical level, I think, I have small kids, I have a job, I have a dog, I have and when am I supposed to have that chat with my AI health assistant when I'm not even I'm trying to get everyone ready and to get out of the house? But I think that's a design problem in a way as well. I think there is probably good ways of solving that. And I think actually that's where AI can be also quite helpful, because it can be a lot more contextual. And I wonder, how much those devices that we will see emerge in the next couple of years will help in that regard. But I do wonder, just as a time component, you need to be very focused on your health to be ready to allocate that specific time to go through that process, which requires a reasoning that happens before that will get you to say, you know what, I will engage in something like that for a specific amount of time to establish a new behavior.
No, I think that's a very good push, and it is a design problem. I think part of the solution will be to move away from the text-based interface and move into an audio-based interface. And here you can more easily blend those conversations into the actual daily lives of people. Let's imagine someone does running, or instead of listening to a podcast for the first 2-3 minutes while you have that little conversation, and then you actually ask the agent like to launch whatever podcast, and you could probably like even blend it into that whole journey.
What do you mean? Like, people are supposed to be listening to this podcast while they're running.
But I think that's so. I think Apple just introduced, like, for the next update of the Apple Watch, introduced like an audio like coach that gives you like feedback on your running and stuff like that. It's interesting, like the stuff that you mentioned. I see a couple of the companies like right on the edge towards that. Like if I'm looking at the AI coach in Whoop, and how it works, and how you can have like you have a conversation in the morning, you have a conversation in the evening. If you want to, you can trigger it, and then you can just, like today, like the AI coach told me, like, oh, it actually looks quite good. Here's what I would recommend based on your usual behavior. And I said, you know what? I'm going to take a rest day because I had 3 days of intense workouts behind me, and I'm just not quite feel that way. And it was like, yeah, perfect. Makes total sense. Do that. Can I help you? Do you need suggestions how to recover well and how to move this stuff? And so it feels like if it would just start with how do you feel today and then give me it's almost there. It's interesting how that works. For me, it's actually quite interesting, like over the last 10 years, seeing these devices evolve, like in the beginning, and to a certain extent, like it feels like Apple Health is still there. It's just like, here's data. You're like, that's a lot of data, and now what? And then you had like the counter movement with like apps coming out. Is like, here's just this one number, and like biological age is one of them, but others like, here's just like this super, like, here's just one thing, like, okay, so but. And now it's moving much more into like, okay, here are different areas, and I have suggestions what might be helpful to do that. So, like with the Whoop age, it actually is quite transparent of everything that goes into that, of your behavior and how it like in what is influencing in what way, the number. And then you can set specific goals, like saying like, this week I'm going to focus on upping my like zone 4 or 5 and trying to get it from, on average I do like 10 minutes. I want to get it to 12 minutes or something like that. So it's fascinating to see the development this field has done. And I think it's interesting to talk about it this week, because RFK Jr. Has just announced a big push for wearables in the US. It's part of his whole Make America Healthy Again. And he has set the goal that every American is going to wear a wearable within the next 4 years, which is pretty crazy. And they're going to do like huge campaigns around that. And there's a lot of like, I think Maha is really fascinating as a movement, because there is some points where like you're not wrong there.
That's true.
But you're going into very complicated direction. And I just want to, like, for the end of it, I want to come back to what you said at the beginning, like the different waves in which we move. Because one of the parts that, for example, he's going to push is continuous glucose monitors, which we've talked about also on this show. And from my own experience with them, those are one of the wearables where it's very easy to over-interpret super personalized data. Like if you're not diabetic, the data you get from a continuous glucose monitor, it's very easy without any like guidance to over-interpret those numbers and like, oh no, I have to correct this. Like, no, like they're not, for example, they're not calibrated towards people who are metabolically healthy and things like that. So I think this is going to be an interesting part if you push those devices very much on everyone. And for me, it's like I always say, I think it makes sense for everyone to wear a wearable for a couple of weeks just to learn some basic stuff of like, oh, actually, like my heart rate is always kind of elevated or something like that, with very good guidance. I think like this for me is like the main thing that's still very bad, like teaching and like health literacy in apps is still a point to improve on. But so I'm very, very torn about this, like campaign to get every American a wearable. What do you think about it based on your research?
I look forward to seeing a lot of obese Americans driving petrol pickups wearing an Oura ring.
Yeah, no, I mean it's an interesting case. It's like one of those classic cases where what looks good theoretically, right? Like it's like, well, we're gonna have more data. More data necessarily means that we're gonna be able to make better choices, both at the individual level and at the macro level. Actually doesn't necessarily translate. So I'm a little bit like you. Like I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but it does ask a lot of systemic question. Like how will the actual system be able to make sense, process, create benefits from that data? And that's always where things get very tricky, right? So just like simple things in other projects that we've seen is it's even people who just like have now, done genetic tests, for example. And if you, well, now, 23andMe is a little bit a company of the past, but if you ever used it, you basically had some little pre-made leaflets that they would give you to actually, whenever you go to the doctor, you can see that you have like these specific genetic modifications. So it means that you might be more or less receptive to this or this other type of treatment, right? I mean, in the face of it, is that a good thing? It's probably a good thing. Then, like, how do doctors actually make sense of that, the HCPs? How do they know that it is information that is correct? How do they know that the person who did the test actually understands that it was like the right one, is not the one of someone else? How do they know that they're going to be able then like to provide the right recommendations that people will be able to understand? This is when things get a little bit complicated. It also means that, and it doesn't look like much, but that for every doctor's visit, well, you have, if everyone has it, all of a sudden it's like 3, 4, 5 minutes more in each visit at the systemic level. That is a huge change in terms of how many people you can process in a given amount of time. So I would hope for, and that's not what this administration has been known for, that they're thinking ahead of all of these systemic questions, right? And that they're having informed sessions with all of the HCPs, of the like representatives and stakeholders of the healthcare system, to first think of, okay, so this is how we're going to use that information if it does come through, rather than just like, launch and say, hey, everyone's going to wear the wearables and it's going to be phenomenal. That would probably not help much.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like a coherent strategy doesn't seem to look like you throwing off 10 million people of Medicaid and then making everybody else wear a wearable. So you will know that you will die soon, but you can't afford to go to the doctor.
No, that you see the actual effect of you not getting a vaccine for the disease that is spreading.
Like I think like the United States are obviously like a very specific kind of also ideological component to how health is being interpreted. And I would argue, I mean, we actually did the whole episode about it, where I compared, a lot of the health as a luxury thing to everyone trying to be Patrick Bateman from American Psycho, and I mean, even without the murderous part, it's kind of interesting how the movie depicts, or the book as well, depicts his obsession with looking healthy, but not actually being healthy, right? Like they go out and drink a lot, like they eat out those really heavy meals. So a lot of that space also where economics are kind of working against kind of long-term behavioral change, is that underneath it all, most people, or I don't know if most people, but I think a lot of people are really interested in the perception of well-being, but not actual longevity. Like as Johannes said, like we know a lot of things about ourselves that we're doing that are not great for us. But I think like culturally, and I think that's where it becomes kind of interesting to me, I think culturally it's very hard to align the science, the technology, the economics with other things that are pushing us against a certain kind of like behavior and behavioral change.
I mean, that's fair. I think it's the sad reality of human biology is that we are not designed, or we haven't evolved to respond well to long-term benefits. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
And it's our drama. I think it's perhaps like our main drama, our curse as humans.
Well, to end it on a maybe more positive note, is there anything from your own experience or your research where you say this is like an underappreciated part of health, or like we should just go more running, that would do us good? I always say we should eat more arugula or rocket, as the British say, and then everybody would be better. Is there anything where you'd say like, take a look at this might be helpful?
Well, I think it's the classic one that won't surprise anyone, but it's the social aspect. I think that one thing we have evolved into as human beings is we're social beings. And if you look at all kinds of academic studies and medical studies, the very fact of having conversations and being exposed to others is actually beneficial for an incredible amount of ailments and diseases. And it's also quite pleasurable. So I think that's probably like the main thing that I would tell people. I'm not a medical professional, but I feel confident I can say that to people. Go talk to people, try to meet new people, speak, and everything will go just a little bit better.
That's a good way to end an episode. Thank you so much, Cyril, for being here. I think this was a really, really interesting conversation, and I'm sure we'll have you back sooner than later to talk about new developments in this space.
Thank you both so much. It's been a really lovely conversation. And, as we have just met, Johannes, I think we'll both do a little bit better as we had that conversation.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for making the time to listen to Follow the Rabbit. Please let us know your thoughts and suggestions by sending an email to ftr@knownunknowns.xyz. Like the episode on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. And most of all, share the episode with others who might find it interesting. It really helps us out. Thank you so much for listening in. Talk to you soon.